So in this module, we're going to explore an important concept for understanding the Southwest, Mestizaje. And we're going to, a couple of learning objectives for this week, this module: define Mestizaje, explain cultural adaptation, analyze implications, and then again, connect past to present. How does the past shape what's happening today? So Mestizaje refers to the mixing of cultures, people, and identities, especially between indigenous communities and Spanish colonizers. Keep in mind, though, it's not just about race, it's about language, religion, tradition, and also daily life. So go back and think about, because we were all there when this happened, think about when the Spanish arrived in the 1500s. They didn't enter an empty land. It's not like they just came and nobody was here. There were millions of people here. Indigenous peoples already had complex societies, and what followed was a process of cultural blending, but also conflict, coercion, and adaptation. And you need to keep in mind that a lot of time, this mixing, this cultural blending, it wasn't always voluntary. It often took place within systems of power. So remember, we looked at the missions and we kind of looked at the forts and how the missions were there and how they, the forts supported the missions, but there was always usually soldiers at the forts and within the mission systems. So you have the mission system. Indigenous peoples were often pressured to adopt Spanish religion and ways of life, forced upon them a lot of times. A lot of times, indigenous peoples were forced into slavery, and they were forced to assimilate, and they were forced to convert to Christianity. And what we see over time is, and we talked a little bit about some of the rebellions that happened. There was the Pueblo Revolt in the 1600s, I believe. Don't quote me because I'm terrible on dates. But the Pueblo Revolt, where the Pueblo rose up and they chased the Spanish out for a few decades. So we do see some revolts happening. But what's also important is over time, the Spanish began to adapt, and so did indigenous peoples. They blended cultures in creative ways, and we see this especially in food, in language, religion, and even in our architecture. Think about something like Spanglish. That's a modern example of this cultural blending that has these very deep historical roots. All right, so let's talk about why this matters. First, it shapes identity. People in the Southwest developed identities that were not purely indigenous or Spanish, but it was something totally new. It also existed alongside inequality. And we see Spanish colonial systems created hierarchies that privileged some groups over others. So keep in mind, yes, it does blend, and we're going to talk more about this blending where we get like Mexican, Chicano, Chicana, Latin, Latina, Latino, Latinx. And keep in mind, while this is happening, like identity is fluid, it goes kind of back and forth. It's not one fixed thing. But let's look at these implications of power when we talk about the casta system. So down here at the bottom, you have enslaved peoples. The Spanish at first tried to enslave the indigenous peoples that were already here. That proved to not work out very well for the Spanish. So over time, what we see are indigenous slaves being replaced by slaves coming in from Africa into the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean into North America. Above, so you have enslaved peoples at the bottom. And this is like in most colonial societies, you're going to see kind of the same thing. But for this one specifically, we're going to look at specifically Spain. So then you have Native Americans above enslaved people. Then you have your mixed race people, right? You've got born of Spanish and Native American. Then we have another group, and this is not to be confused with like the Creoles of like Louisiana Creole. So Louisiana Creoles, those are Black, indigenous, and mixed. What we have in the Southwest, like in New Mexico, Arizona, California, those Creoles are a little bit different. And this is, they are born in New Spain of Spanish parents. And this comes from a word, criollo, which are those New Spain, New Spanish. Those are like the criollos of like California. Over time, criollo loosely got to be known as Creole. And so sometimes those two are confused. Like, again, you have your Creoles of Louisiana, which come from like an enslaved population of Africans, and then your Criollo, which comes from New Mexico, Arizona, California area, that Southwest. So it's, if you've ever heard of those two, don't get those two confused is what I'm saying. We're talking about the Creoles of the American Southwest. So they are born here, they're born in New Spain, but their parents are from Spain. They're like first generation, if you will, right? And then you've got your Spaniards that are born in Spain that migrate here. They're going to be at the top of the pyramid. So your true Spaniards, and then your first generation Spaniards that are born here in New Spain, born in the Americas, those are next. Then you've got your mixed race, then you have your Native Americans, and then at the very bottom you have your enslaved people. But it sets up like this caste system that we have in like Spanish colonies. And this is like, there's a lot of power involved, and you can tell who's at the top and who's at the bottom with this power. With that though, you also have a lot of resilience and resistance that is happening. And communities, they do preserve their traditions, they adapt it and they survive, but it's often violent conflict in order to do this. But in order to preserve some of that culture, we see cultural creativity, and the Southwest really becomes a unique cultural space shaped by this blending. So centuries of resistance, centuries of adaptation, centuries of trying to hold something personal and hold that culture together. And we see a blending of these cultures. So it's not just something from the past, it's ongoing. And today, many people in the Southwest continue to navigate multiple cultural identities in their everyday lives. So, and we can see we have like new cultural forms, we have new art, music, language, unique, a very unique Southwest culture. And we're going to really start to get into that. After this week, we're going to start to look at the Chicano movement. You're going to be reading a book called The Chicano Movement for Beginners that will introduce you to kind of the struggles that the Chicanos have faced in the Southwest and how this identity has really been defined, and it's even changed over the last few decades, but how it has come to prominence. So when we talk about this mixing, we're really talking about history and culture and identity coming together and how it's going to continue to evolve over time. So think about bilingual and bicultural identities, and a lot of you in this class kind of have this dual almost identity to yourself. Like you come to school and you come to class and you speak English, but then when you go home, you speak a different language, whether that's, you know, an indigenous language or a Latin-based language like Spanish. And we see the blending of traditions across generations. And really this ongoing negotiation of identity in schools, like here at Phoenix College, communities, and media. And how you identify yourself, that can change over time. Like I said, that's fluid. It doesn't have to be fixed all the time. So you could see yourself as Latin, you could see yourself as Chicano, you could see yourself as Latinx, as Indigenous, as First Peoples, and that it's okay to change that over time because identity, it's always changing and evolving. So key takeaways for this, it is, there we go. Historical process that was shaped by colonization. It's an ongoing experience of cultural blending, and it's a source of both inequality and creativity, and also it's a foundation for modern identity and community. So as we move through this module, start to think about how the blending of cultures has happened, and as we move into the next module, you're going to be reading more and more about Chicano specifically and the Chicano movement.